Welcome to segment 2 of this masterclass on cloud, emerging tech and platforms and their relationship to government services. If you recall, in segment 1, we started to define cloud, have a quick look at its history, and started to understand how the cloud-based market for services has been evolving over the last decade or so. And finally, we looked at some opportunities that are arising for governments increasingly to consume standard modular capabilities from the cloud rather than building them themselves and reinventing the wheel. In segment 2, we're now going to take a little bit of a look at platforms. And the reason I want to do this is that platforms are often misused in the terminology. We often think of a platform as just a piece of technology rather than a way of organizing our business. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on platforms. Here I'm going to draw on a UK-based academic called Annabel Gower, whose work I very much admire, and who is one of the best-known academics on platforms globally. Annabel has quite a nice way of thinking about platforms, and she describes the evolution of the platform-based business model like this. So to begin with, you can see she has some examples of internal platforms shown here in the highlighted part of the text on this slide. So the story here was that individual organizations, and the examples she gives are Hewlett-Packard printers and Rolls-Royce aero engines as examples, began to realize that internally they were organized into many silos. And each of those silos, of course, was responsible for building different products. And because none of those silos cooperated with each other, every time they wanted to evolve or rebuild or launch a new product, they had to build that product from the ground upwards from scratch. So for example, every Rolls-Royce aero engine, so the story goes, had all of its components unique to that aero engine, rather than sharing the ones that they could use commonly. And so once they started to share these things commonly, they realized some immediate advantages. Of course, there were cost savings from not having to reinvent and rebuild every single component for every single one of their engines. But not only were there cost savings, but there were enormous efficiencies. Why? Because, of course, now that they didn't have to design everything from the ground up every time, it took much less time to get their engines to market. They could design a new engine and save lots of time by recombining basic capabilities across the organization so that they could produce things more quickly. And they also began to discover a third advantage, which was, of course, that by reusing shared capabilities at the back end, they could then offer more customization at the front end. So they could produce more aero engines more cheaply and customize them more towards their customers' requirements. So successful was this model, in fact, that we then started to see it being replicated in her second example, which is often called co-opetition. So cooperation and competition together. So here we've got automotive competitors such as Renault and Nissan here, who have come together. These people are enemies on the forecourt when it comes to selling their cars, but they realize that actually many of their customers don't really care about a lot of the common components of cars, whether it's a Renault component or whether it's a Nissan component. For example, brake calipers. Do they really care whether they are bespoke to Renault or Nissan, or whether they're just a generic component? And so again, Renault and Nissan found they could produce more models, more customized, a nicer range of choice for their customers, more cheaply and more efficiently and more often as a result. But it's the third type of platforms, the digital platforms, the open platforms that Annabel Gower describes here, that are really of interest to us. They operate on the same principles as the other two, but the great difference here is that here the platform operators want anybody to come and join. In the previous two examples, we know who is in the club. Okay, now these are examples of organizations that are attracting as many people globally to come and play on the platform as possible. So let's take a dive into what we mean by that. This is one of the most useful diagrams I've seen, actually. It comes from a European Union policy document, but actually it explains quite nicely the two main types of platforms that we can see. I hope you find this helpful. So here we can see transaction platforms, and I'm not going to read them out here, you can see, but they are simple examples where we have a brokerage that bring together sellers of services and buyers of those services. Very, very simple. They don't try and do anything too clever. They just make everything very, very easy for everybody. And on the right-hand side, we have platforms that then try and also innovate, so try and create new ways of doing things that used to be done in traditionally more traditional ways of doing things. And in the middle, you can see so-called hybrid companies. And again, most of these, of course, are household names. So hybrid companies that combine the ability to transact powerfully with the ability to innovate. So let's take a look at how those might work. This is also one of my favourite pictures because I think it's very helpful to explain how platforms work. Now this actually goes back to a Harvard Business Review article way back in 2005, but actually if you just update the numbers, of course there are billions of users on Google now, the dynamics of the platform are the same. In the centre of this picture you can see Google itself, the Google platform, like the spider in the centre of the web. But of course Google isn't arrogant enough to think that it can outcompete, outthink and out-innovate the rest of the world. Google's business model, of course, is to invite everyone to play on its platform. So on the top right you have people like you and me who use the Google platform for a variety of different purposes. And why do we do that? We do that because there's a range of content on the platform from the other players that you can see around here, as well as a host of other organizations, from advertisers to media companies, to analysts, to academics, to journalists, to all sorts of people who upload, consume, and comment on data on the Google platform. Google can then, of course, if it wants to, sell that data and intelligence to people who are willing to pay for it. So Google, again, crowdsources ideas and content and innovation, but is, if you like, the glue that sits at the center of it. So that Google is the platform owner around an ecosystem of innovation and investment. If you think about it, Google would be worth nothing at all without its ecosystem of activity. It would just simply be some dead technology. So the way of understanding platforms is that every platform has to have an ecosystem. A platform, indeed, without an ecosystem makes as much sense as one hand clapping. It just doesn't make any sense. And so, of course, what we want to explore, of course, is how government can behave more like a platform. How can government start to harness this very, very powerful platform-based business model that we saw in the previous segment is starting to dominate the market capitalization of many of the dominant markets in the world. Here's another example of a household name. This is, of course, the Apple iOS App Store. And this charts the idea that there are over 4 million apps in the iOS App Store. And if you just pause to think about that, that's an extraordinary number, isn't it? Apple may have more cash than most organizations on the planet and lots of clever people working for Apple, but even Apple, with the clever people and all its money, could not possibly build 4 million apps in its App Store. It relies, if you like, on the market, its ecosystem of innovation and investment to build those apps. And in turn, those innovators and investors in the ecosystem are attracted to build and spend time and investing in the iOS platform because of all the users that Apple has. And so the more apps there are in the platform, the more people want to come on board and use the platform, and the more powerful the platform ecosystem business model becomes. And so just to drive home that point, this is some examples of simple platforms, again, just so that we're not confused, simple transactional platforms here. So again, we have producers and we have consumers of services, and the platform typically sits in the middle. And if we look at that model with some of the common platforms we might be familiar with, Skyscanner, for example, producers are, of course, airlines, and consumers are travelers, obviously. treating yourself with Uber, with the Uber platform. Again, the producers, if you like, are drivers and the consumers are passengers. Amazon Mechanical Turk, the producers are people who are happy to provide administrative and office services remotely, and the consumers are people who want to commission those services again. And Airbnb, again, the producers are people with flats and accommodation to let, and the consumers are people who rent. The platform sits in the middle. And as we can see from these two images here, we can see on the left a very, very early example of Skyscanner's platform, which just offers flights. It just asks you where you want to go. Once the platform model evolves, we can look at the right-hand recent screenshot of a Skyscanner website, which is, of course, the Skyscanner website now has lots of users, a big ecosystem of users on the platform. It's able to collect data. Because it has more data about them, it's able to form partnerships with other people who can use that data. So, for example, car hire companies and hotel companies that might be of interest to me when I'm on the Skyscanner platform booking my flight. So you can see once the flywheel gets going, once the machine gets going, we can start to collect data and improve the services we can offer to citizens. A final example in government, which I used in my previous module on local government services, is NHS Jobs, an example of a platform that replaced 650 siloed, very traditional ways of doing recruitment for the UK National Health Service with a single, vastly improved platform recruitment service that provided 24/7 national visibility across the entire organisation for a fraction of the cost. Thank you very much.